You're listening to Science and Saucery, a show dedicated to exploring innovative minds and adding life to your years. And now, your host, scientist Rick Cronise.
Welcome. I'm very excited about today's guest. Tim Ferriss really gave me my start in everything I'm doing here in HealthSpan and research in terms of mild cold stress. And we're going to talk a little bit about the story of how that began. It's hard to believe that it's been over a decade since we had a chance event and a single question changed the course of everything I was doing. I didn't intend to be a diet guru or a weight loss coach or even a researcher in metabolism and health span. For me, it was really more practical. I had a situation, I was overweight. I had a huge crisis that had happened in my life in terms of a major change. And I decided to put my health first. I was having major issues with high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance. And while I was following precisely what people said to do, I was having conflicts in my results. And one thing Tim Ferriss represents to me was this idea of the self-exploration. And that's not to say that an N of one means everything, but at the other side of that, an N of one doesn't mean nothing either. So bringing Tim on today and us having this conversation, there's so many subjects we could talk about, so many notes I have here about things we might go into. But I think it's going to be enjoyable because all of my conversations with him have always been provocative and challenging. And I hope we can get to a lot of the subjects that I got DMs and messages about with him today. So I've got notes here and hopefully we can go in that direction. But with that, I want to introduce probably one of the leading podcasters out there, author, multi-New York Times bestselling author, over 500 million downloads on his podcast. And Tim's really unique feature is that he focuses on asking the right questions. And so I would lie if I wouldn't say I'm not a little bit intimidated to interview the king of interviews and asking questions on podcasts. But at the same time, I also know him as a friend, and he assured me that we would just have one of our great conversations that we've had together. So with that, I'd like to bring on Tim Ferriss. Welcome, Tim, to Science and Saucery.
Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
It's so great to finally have you on. You're probably the number one person requested to interview since technically you started me into this crazy chapter of my life. And I'd like to sort of set this up and sort of reflect a little bit on when we met. I think we originally actually met through Joe Polish. I think it was at Nathaniel Brandon's talk. Do you remember going to that?
I'm not sure I recall. That was probably in the period when I was going to a lot of talks in 2007, 2008. And then I do recall more concretely NASA Ames.
That's right. So then a year later or a year or so later, we meet up at the Singularity University, International Space University inaugural event at NASA Ames. And Peter Diamandis introduced us, but we had already met through Joe, and you had seen that I lost all this weight. We talked about it. And there is this question you asked me that sort of changed my entire life. You said, "Hey, dude, can you keep a secret? I'm writing a book and I want to tell this story. Can you go back to where you were with the 4-Hour Body?"
Let's see. I was probably in the early stages or midpoint stages of putting together the 4-Hour Bodies. The 4-Hour Work Week is my first book. It come out in April of 2007, which is crazy to think about, back when I had hair. And I had decided, following up or drafting on the very unexpected success of the 4-Hour Work Week, which was turned down by 27 or 29 publishers, that I did not want to do a follow-up in the same genre or topic of, let's just broadly speaking, call it entrepreneurship, because it would cement painting myself into a corner. And then I would be the 3-hour work week guy, the 2-hour work week guy,
Right.
and so on. And eventually you run out of the ability to subtract. But this physical experimentation had always been such an obsession and fascination of mine that decided to write that book. And it was intended to really be, let's just call it 15 separate mini books on different facets of the human experience and changing, modifying, optimizing those different aspects. And so when you brought up the cold exposure, I already had this deep interest in thermoregulation and cold exposure, but had never taken it anywhere close to what you had done. And you had really translated that interest into something so immensely practical and powerful and personal. I saw it right before me, that I felt like it had to be included, or at the very least, we should explore including that and highlighting that.
Right. And it was really fun as we were going through this process for a lot of people that read a lot of your books and aren't sort of in the behind the scenes side of it. Not that I was part of everything, but a part of that. You know, you really wanted to vet things. You really challenged me on a lot of the points in our calls that we had along the way. And that's what I guess I respected the most. And you also said, like, this was the book you always really wanted to write, was that you wanted to write this thing about self-experimentation. And, you know, it's now launched into a whole different direction, which I think is a continuum of that. But talk a little bit about that drive and that wanting to really get that out there in the forefront, because you were sort of an early person on this idea.
Happy to chat about it. And certainly I'm not the first self-experimenter, of course, right? I mean, you have a long history.
But Lavoisier, if you want to really go back.
Right. You can go as far back as you want to go back, even before. I mean, the first person to eat a lobster, right? Think about that. That's self-experimentation.
I always use steamed crabs as an example. Like, who in the world would try that?
Yeah. Who was the first person to go, that looks delicious, let's try that? And then you have people like Ben Franklin and so on who are doing it in different capacities. And really where I had tremendous luck is I ended up writing my first book and publishing my first book when technology and wearables and tracking had, as a confluence of different bits and bytes of technology and also interest, come to make all of those things much easier. It's since become exponentially easier, but I recall, I want to say in 2008, I have a photograph of it somewhere, but attending the first quantified self meetup ever. So the first quantified self meetup ever was in Kevin Kelly's home in Northern California. And the late Seth Roberts was there, and many others, Gary Wolf, and
that's right. I remember his book, The Shangri-La Diet.
That's right. So
I emailed back and forth with him quite a bit before that he died.
Before his passing.
Yeah, and we're talking about the ZO and the jawbone. I mean, there were all these things coming out that were starting to be able to really quantify at home, and that's what I was looking at it too.
Right. And the question then on a whole lot of levels became, how do you use these to turn data into actionable insight? Because it wasn't always clear. You had people in the community who were just tracking their moods as it related to menstrual cycle, and they'd done this type of tracking first via pen and paper and later digitally with an Excel spreadsheet and so on, but it had never made the hop to modification of behavior, much less modification of sort of your physical embodiment in life. And I came from an athletic background. way back in the day. I mean, I was a competitive wrestler and was always fascinated by physical manipulation, performance enhancing training, but also performance enhancing drugs and everything you can name under the sun of performance enhancing. And it was really the fact that I was effectively given a platform or built a platform at the same time that these nascent technologies were blending with physical tracking. And I took that and ran with it. I said, hey, this is the perfect time to do this. And it turned out that it was.
It really was.
Seemingly the perfect time to do it.
I certainly had no idea how profoundly that question at Singularity that night would change my life, but it did. And, fast forwarding to 2010, right after the book came out, because this is what really launched me in, I did some of the molecule stretch, which is all detailed in 4-Hour Body. But it was after the book came out, the one thing I hadn't really thought about ever before was that that's when the challenges start. And so I put up a blog and I started blogging because you said, hey, you've got to capture some stuff here. People are going to come wanting things. And I wasn't doing this to make a living or anything. This was just something I did because thermodynamically it made sense. It wasn't, something I was trying to sell or create or whatever. It was just simply the pure self-experiment for science sake. And if you remember, everybody was challenging your number of calories. And I started digging into that. I replied back and we talked back and forth about how one answers, how many calories are in a pound of fat, et cetera. But it was really, at the time, it was when a book comes out, and I now know that when it comes out, people really challenge the veracity. And then people started attacking me as well. Like, you didn't really lose this weight. Oh, this cold didn't really have anything to do with it. And that ended up unintentionally driving me to sort of get that midlife crisis calorimeter so that I could start really digging in, and led to the next decade of just crazy self-experimentation and exploration. But I want to sort of bring that up because really and truthfully, I think you did this for a lot of people, not just me. I think you started a lot of people looking down these paths and popularized it in a way it really hadn't been popularized before. And that still continues today. I think what you're doing now is more of the same thing. So, but anyway, just this idea that calories count when you count all the calories. And if you recall at the time, you have Gary Taubes and Good Calorie, Bad Calorie, and lots of people really trying to get to the bottom of what calories are and how they count, and also how to measure it and how to effectively utilize it. But ultimately, it really comes down to lifestyle transformation. And so taking a leap forward in all of that discussion a decade, you've really been asking the right questions that end in positive personal transformation, or helping people ask the right questions. Can you tell us a little bit about this entire exploration and how that's played out in your life?
I'll give it a go. What I didn't mention earlier, I don't think I necessarily answered the personal experimentation answer or question rather directly, and it ties into this because I have emphysema in my left lung. I have a number of constraints when it applies to athletics, wrestling, or otherwise, and I had to devise ways to work around that. I also had some other limitations. That meant I had very poor thermoregulation. I couldn't cool myself effectively, so I've been hospitalized a few times for a heat stroke. Wow. And I had still have very poor endurance. And that was really one of the drivers behind the most primitive early self-experimentation, which then led to considering bronchodilators and all of these various ways of working around my deficiencies. And what I realized at the time in doing all sorts of reading, and I was good at ferreting things out, even in college, let's say, became much better later, and then tools like Google and PubMed and so on make it much easier, is that the exercise, the coaches of elite athletes were always at least a few years ahead of the exercise scientists who focused on published papers, which seems really self-evident, but often people go fishing in the pond of published literature to find tools to improve their lives. But what they're really finding are the tentative publications that suggest certain things might help, but they're often 5 or 10 years behind the practitioners, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
That is, and there is a place for randomized control trials and all of these tightly supervised and refined study designs. I believe that, and I've put millions of dollars in what you might consider traditional science. And so there is a real place for that. You have to ensure that you're not fooling yourself. You have to ensure results are replicable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in the meantime, I'm a real believer in the power of direct experience.
Yes.
And there are certain hypotheses, which science, by the way, when people say science, right, the scientific method is a framework for thought.
Yes.
And ensuring you're not fooling yourself, but it doesn't help you to generate hypotheses, right? And that's where asking good questions comes in. How do you generate the hypotheses worth testing? Because not all questions are good, or they don't provide the fruit or the kernel that can become something significant. So I've always been a big fan of the absurd and asking really outrageous questions, and that shows certainly in 4-Hour Body, it shows in 4-Hour Chef, it shows in how I invest, it shows in most areas of my life where much like, let's just take Peter Thiel as an example, famed entrepreneur, investor, former CEO of PayPal, who's done a million things since. And his question that he poses sometimes to people, which I'll paraphrase here, is why can't you accomplish your 10-year goals in the next 6 months, right? Or how could you achieve your 10-year goals in the next 6 months?
Right.
And what a question like that does, and we're pulling outside of self-experimentation for a second here, but the same rubric applies. You can't really tackle that with your current set of frameworks and constraints, right? This would be a very kind of Peter Diamandis approach also. So it's shown up for me and proven valuable over and over and over and over again. And there are certain areas of exploration that are going to take a long time for PubMed, things you'll find on PubMed, to catch up to. So I would say that self-experimentation is intelligent, well-documented. Self-experimentation is core to almost everything that I do.
And to reinforce that, Warner von Braun said you're a crackpot till you hit the jackpot. And my mentor sort of in innovation was aviation entrepreneur. I just interviewed him recently, Burt Rutan. And Burt, I spent a lot of time learning from him. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he's just...
I don't.
He's such a innovator. He's the guy who won the X Prize with Spaceship One, the designer, and did the Voyager that flew nonstop around the world. He's got 5 planes in the National Air and Space Museum, so that says something. But one of the things he says, you have to have competence and nonsense if you want to innovate. Because if you go to all those innovative ideas and go to the time just before them, a lot of them would be very nonsensical. And it's not that you just have to do crazy things, but a lot of times innovation comes out of the idea or concept that you don't know you can't do something. You're trying something, other people are stopped. And this is, again, the intersection of your work and innovation is this idea that I can push past. And it's okay that there are things in the 4-Hour Body that aren't rigorous, that it is the early thought. And it just seems like this really follows on to what you're saying, is that, the idea of even PubMed, when they ask the wrong questions, get the wrong answers. Peer-reviewed answers that are incorrect. Because let's face it, there's lots of papers that must have been wrong. Today, the plus side is that anybody can get access to all this information with their phone. And the downside is it can be so taken out of context that it becomes almost more confusing than not having the information. So, but this idea of being a self-experimenter, when you have that reality and you really do it this way and it works repeatedly, I think that there is a validity in that. I don't have to have a peer-reviewed, double-blind, controlled study for a hammer hitting my thumb. An N of 1's just fine. I'm not going to do it. So there are some things that are that obvious. And one of the things that I think has happened in that is that these larger studies, which are very beneficial at hunting for side effects, unintentional side effects for large drug trials, aren't always better than small trials that are very controlled, for example, metabolic ward studies, especially when it comes to food. So the idea of just having a large sample size is not the only metric, and sometimes it actually could be a bad metric.
Well, not only that, underscore something you said, garbage in, garbage out. You ask a bad question, you can get precisely the correct answer to a bad question that does not make it a productive use of time.
Right.
Number one. Number two, if we're looking at the lay person who is, let's just say, on the bunny slopes of study design literacy, will often throw out what was the N, right? What was the subject size? And if you have, let's just say, an observational study with tons of self-reporting with an N of 1,000, I certainly have not found the majority of those more compelling than a tightly controlled, in-house, measured group of
30.
Say an N of 20.
Yeah, I agree
30.
With you
as long as it's powered, and as long as you've asked a question where you have a chance of observing an amplitude of effect that, combined with that N, provides the type of statistical significance, then you're in the money, or you have the chance of being in the money. I completely agree. And also, with the self-experimentation, it's like, do you need a double-blind, placebo-controlled study if you can do something quickly at low cost, which has almost entirely known knowns, meaning the downside risks are capped, minimal, or non-existent. And it's like, I have eczema. Let me remove A, B, and C foods from my diet and see if my eczema goes away. Right? This is not where
it's not rocket
you're
science.
not taking intravenous treatments of thalidomide or rocket science, right? So it also trains you to think about, if you're approaching it in a thoughtful way, risk assessment and risk mitigation,
right? Which
also transfers all over the place.
Yeah, and what I was doing at the time that became the subject of that chapter was I was doing a Bill Phillips Body for Life very routinely, and I just added this cold stress. Now, clearly over the last decade, I believe there's a lot more involved. And in our paper, Metabolic Winter Hypothesis, there's some of those things. I think there's definitely the work I've done with David Sinclair, that there's definitely some overlap in the sirtuin genes, there's in the upregulation, the mitochondrial upregulation and biogenesis. But the core idea was that mild cold stress needed to burn more calories. And if you recall, all the articles that came out after the 4-hour body hit were all saying, no, you've got this wrong. Your metabolism goes up with heat, not with cold. Do you remember we were getting criticized in the press for that? And it's such a fundamentally true thing. Mm-hmm. I couldn't even believe that they would find people to say that.
Yeah, it's I would rather be approximately right than precisely wrong. Right?
That's a great.
Directionally right.
Yes, directionally right. I use that term all the time.
And my intention when I'm doing these early, look at the early aviation attempts, right? These were fucking ugly. It's like, pardon my French, but this was not pristine, beautiful flight at its best. It was anything but. It was really ugly. And a lot of science is really, really messy. I think that gets glossed over with a lot of the historical summaries you might read, because it's messy. It's really, really messy. And I strive to, as an amateur, I'm not a professional scientist, if I'm doing self-experimentation, to document well, including my assumptions, certainly my measurements and outcomes, such that I might find amongst the garbage and the mess something that seems to be repeatable, that alludes to some impactful truth, right? And I may not understand the mechanism, probably will not understand the mechanism, but if something is reliably repeatable, and I've found some weird stuff that seems to be reliably repeatable, then I get really excited.
Right.
And I think part of the reason I keep doing it is that it gives me so much energy to do it.
Right. By the way we fund science, and this sort of kind of gets into some of the things you've funded, that is why it's so important, is that repeating things is not as scientific or career promoting as discovering new things. And so one thing I've seen in looking at nutrition and metabolism starting in the mid-18th century and moving my way forward is that then people were repeating things a lot because that was part of that community ethos. And today, it's just being first. And so philanthropy that gets out there and funds the edgy new stuff, that's one part of it, but also in a repeatable way that we actually need people to come along and repeat these things. And yet, because of the instant 140 or 240 character kind of headlines, proposals aren't often written to look at things that seem to be true, but maybe they're directionally true, but they're not accurate in a way that you can really model the system. So it's important that people like you are funding things and pushing things that are out on the edge.
Thank you for saying that. I think it's really important. I mean, certainly my domain expertise doesn't go very far. I mean, we're in this case referring mostly to scientific research looking at classical and non-classical psychedelic compounds for treating intractable or what many would consider incurable psychiatric disorders. That would be the tip of the iceberg.
This is your
a lot more
MAPS
to
Capstone Challenge work.
There are a few different initiatives. I was involved as one of the founding funders of the Center for Psychedelic Research at Imperial College London, which was the first dedicated such center in the world, and then also was heavily involved for a period of probably 1.5 to 2 years, all told, as a founding funder of the Center for Consciousness and Psychedelic Research at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And then most recently have been focused on the MAPS Capstone Challenge, which people can find at capstone.maps.org if they're interested. And the importance of that, just in brief, is that MDMA assisted psychotherapy, it's methyl, I think it's methyldioxymethamphetamine is what MDMA stands for, but MDMA assisted psychotherapy for PTSD produces results that are almost beyond belief in terms of efficacy. 2 or 3 sessions, 12-month follow-up, 68% are no longer diagnosable with PTSD using something called the CAPS-5 assessment. That just doesn't happen with any
this is crazy.
currently available treatment. And so there are tremendous, certainly philanthropic implications, humanitarian implications, because there are, I think, I might be getting this number slightly off, but 12 million people in the U.S. who suffer from PTSD, war veterans, victims of sexual abuse, et cetera, complex PTSD. Oh, I neglected to mention something. Those 68% or 67%, 68%, that's data from phase 2, which who were asymptomatic at the 12-month follow-up had been non-responsive to prior treatments and had an average experience of more than 17 years of PTSD.
This is just crazy to
So,
think about. I'm so excited by what you guys are doing.
Yeah. Thanks, man. It is crazy to think about. And, maybe another time with a bit more wine, I'll talk about my personal reasons, and I can talk about some of them, but certainly my personal reasons for being so interested in this. But say I have a lot of personal experience with capital T trauma, and the results defy explanation by conventional psychiatric mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what is so interesting to me.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you look at that data, if you look at the data related to Johns Hopkins using psilocybin, which is thought to be the psychoactive component of psilocybe, certain species of psilocybe mushrooms or magic mushrooms, psilocybe cubensis being the most common in North America. If you look at psilocybin applied to nicotine addiction, smoking, right? And then you look at psilocybin applied to treatment-resistant depression, at least suggest that our understanding of the mind and the ability to rewrite or reformat the narratives we use to define ourselves are either completely misunderstood, or at the very least, there are mechanisms at play that are not even in the textbooks at this point, right? Not even on the radar of the people who consider writing these textbooks. And that, to me, is exciting beyond belief.
Yes.
Having seen the results where, for instance, I know veterans who have gone in, I'm very involved with some of the veteran communities, veterans who've gone into an MDMA session or a psychedelic session, and they come out the other side. This is a single session, right? So the half-life of this is, let's just call it 4 to 6 hours. From a biochemical standpoint, from a sort of neuromechanistic standpoint, there's no reason that one session where the subjective experience lasts, in the case of many of these, 4 to 6 hours, that 6 months later they should still be seeing durable effects. That's just odd, right? It's very strange. And the fact that you can have, as one vet, a friend of mine, former Navy SEAL, went in, he had been experiencing ongoing depression, anxiety, and anger. He had traumatic brain injury and also complex PTSD. And he came out of these experiences, and a few weeks later, he sent me a text, and his wife said, "You're finally the person I married again." Completely, he came out a different person. And the fact that we don't have currently a good explanation for that is what makes me so excited and eager to provide funding, especially if you look at, say, the MAPS Capstone campaign, which I encourage people to check out. Just go to maps.org and you can check it out. They also do a lot of fascinating research elsewhere, is that MDMA would be the tip of the spear if it were reclassified. So right now, all of these compounds are Schedule 1, according to the DEA, which is the most restrictive class. And they are thought to have high abuse potential, no known medical applications, et cetera, et cetera. This is a remnant of the Nixon era prohibition when these compounds were put into these classes for a lot of reasons. But they simply aren't accurate, and toxicity levels are very, very low. And I'll get off my soapbox in a second. But I am applying the same type of exploration that I applied to the physical body and it's still the physical body, don't get me wrong, but to the sort of psychological, neurological, and self and the psyche, effectively. Is it possible to take the stories that we tell ourselves and literally in 2 or 3 sessions overwrite those stories with more enabling stories? And the answer appears to be yes. And that's fucking nuts.
It is crazy. It is crazy. And we have another analog. which
Am I
is
allowed to
the
curse?
microbiome.
I'm from Long Island and I'm drinking wine. Am I okay? Am I okay to curse, or should I hold back on the family programming?
It's fine.
Okay. All right.
We have an analog, which is the microbiome, because forever we didn't have any explanation for Chinese medicine. We would say we don't measure anything substantial in the blood. There isn't any, this is just can't be. And yet now we know that the microbiome does have a huge impact on the overall system. You know, the whole idea that if you read the book, The Second Brain, too, which goes back to when we really started doing this. But more importantly, it also has a feedback to that system that controls all those narratives. And so we're only beginning. This is the follow-on to the Human Genome Project, the Human Microbiome Project. But these kinds of things, I mean, we're just beginning to unravel this. No one really understands all of it.
Yeah.
But what Paul says, and I've had numerous conversations with him, he is adamant that this is just crazy results that no one can explain. That you may not believe it, but they're reproducible over and over again. And why wouldn't we look into it? Why would some made-up rule slow down something that is so beneficial in society?
Hear, hear. And I'll add a few things to that. Number one, I want to ask you about the connection between the microbiome and Chinese medicine, since I'm not up to speed on that, and I'm very interested. But second, just so I can vomit this out and then let you answer that question, is I alluded to this when I mentioned it earlier, but the drugs I'm talking about, the compounds I'm talking about, whether MDMA or psilocybin, who are the two drugs that have been designated by the FDA, right? So this is not, we're not talking about alternative medicine here. We're talking about FDA have been designated by the FDA as breakthrough therapies, and which expedites their review and evaluation. It is because of these results, and neither of these compounds, none of the compounds that I am most interested in, are maintenance drugs.
This is so important.
It's a super important point. Yeah. So if you're taking Prozac or Lexapro or any of these drugs, right, mood stabilizers, SSRIs, and they're very, very important for a lot of people. So I don't want to in any way imply that they don't have tremendous value for some people. Nonetheless, these are drugs you take forever.
There's no end game,
right? Unless you're using them to get through just an event initiated difficult period like a divorce or something like that. And there is a place for that. Ketamine also, I think, has tremendous applications there. But these are compounds that you use in the clinical trials that I'm talking about, at least 1 to 3 times. I think it's generally 2 or 3 sessions, and you're done. That's it. Treatment complete. And that part of the reason there is so little institutional funding for this is no business model currently exists to support drugs that are that efficacious in 2 or 3 sessions, which is why it is not incumbent. It is I view it as a moral imperative for individuals who can, I'm very fortunate to be in that position, provide some funding to further this type of research, because it not only produces better results, but it produces better results in a curative fashion.
Right.
Not in a maintenance, numbing of symptoms fashion. And those are 2 different worlds.
It's as if it's rewiring the brain.
That's right.
And you're really big on neuroplasticity, and you've shown lots of different examples of the fact that our brain, we're not locked into one narrative and one mindset, that we actually do continue to have that neuroplasticity long into adulthood, and we can make those changes. It's not easy, but it can be done.
And you can enhance neurogenesis with, for instance, this is suggestive, but psilocybin would be an example. I know one ER physician who is trying to secure funding to use psilocybin with acute traumatic brain injury patients who come into the ER to mitigate inflammation and brain damage, as an example. That is unproven. That's a hypothesis, but there's a fair amount to suggest that that is a worthwhile experiment. And it has been so incredibly, and I'll just personalize this. I mean, I've spent most of my life hating myself and making myself an instrument of competition to find value, and assuming that my lot in life was to serve that function, and that was it. And then at the end, you die, you turn to dust. If I die sooner rather than later, that's fine. And as I think you know, and I spoke about in my TED Talk, had a brush with suicide in college, came very close to completing it. And that was my homeostasis, right? That was my status quo. And that is no longer the case. I also used to have major depressive episodes once or twice a year. Beginning 6 years ago, no longer the case. I mean, that's bonkers. It was never even within the realm of my imagination that such a fundamental shift could be possible. It seemed ridiculous. It seemed completely ridiculous to consider that were an option. And nonetheless, here we are.
And so many people look at that. They look at your degree of success and what you have, and they criticize as if this is some horrible situation. But the idea of signaling the tribe, leaving the tribe at some evolutionary path was certain death. You know, you didn't live solo. Very few people did. So signaling the tribe and saying, am I worth it? And the tribe signaling back and saying, yes, you are, which is sort of at the root of a lot of these suicidal things. It doesn't matter how successful you are. It doesn't matter how people see you. It's how you see yourself in those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. And also keep in mind, I mean, the depressive episodes and suicidal ideation and so on came long before any worldly success that I might have had.
Right.
And do have, which I'm very fortunate to have. Also worked very, very hard.
Right. Didn't you change your TED Talk like right before you walked out, like you were going to talk about something else? Or am I just imagining
That's good memory. That's a good memory. No, you're not. I was invited to speak at TED. I'd done a lot of speaking up to that point. I haven't in the last 5 years done much public speaking for reasons we could talk about, but I was invited to speak at TED, and I was very intimidated. And it was going to be on the main stage in the opening session. It was going to be live cast to movie theaters around the country. And I was really, really nervous. And I had a talk ready to go. I put a talk together that was very safe, kind of sat in my zone of self-experimentation and so on. And I think it would have been well received. And I want to say 24, maybe 36 hours before my final video rehearsal, because at least in my case, and I know this is true with a lot of other speakers, they do rehearsals in front of Chris Anderson and others at TED via video chat, Zoom or some other technology. And I pulled an all-nighter about 36 hours before and put together an entirely new talk, because I realized that I came to the realization, at least for me, that to do a talk was to squander an incredible opportunity, and that no one's guaranteed to have a long life, right? I could get hit by a bus. I could slip on a patch of ice. People get taken out all the time, and I'm not an exception to that. So knowing that this may be the one and only time I'm on the TED main stage with this type of audience, with this type of amplification, it felt like a moral directive to talk about the pain, right? And part of what makes each of us unique is whatever our particular brand of pain is that we have felt, the crucible, whatever the struggle is that most people don't know anything about, that you have fought, that is part of what connects you to the rest of humanity in a very powerful way. And to not share that on stage, I think would have been criminal. So I rewrote the whole thing. And I remember telling Chris, who I suppose owns TED on some level. I'm not sure the exact structure, but he bought TED from Richard Saul Werman. I can't remember his name. In any case, the point being, he's kind of the head honcho. And I told him I'd rewritten it. And I remember telling Chris, if you have to find somebody else, I totally understand. I completely rewrote the talk. And at the end of it, which was a very rough draft, given the all-nighter and everything, he said, well, I've got some bad news. I think you're still going to have to give this talk. And I'm really glad I did. So I talked about the depression and the near suicide attempt, and basically the safety net and the tools in the toolkit that I've used to avoid getting that close to the precipice.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember, just because when I was going to do the TED Med, it certainly was a unbelievable audience sitting out there in front of you, and I had never really talked in front of that many Nobel laureates and various people that were all just far more accomplished than me. And you were talking about the fact that it was sort of the go big or go home, what I think people would expect from Tim Ferriss. But we were talking about my TED talk, and it was like, okay, well, it's a really difficult position. Even though I'm usually comfortable on stage, it was very, very difficult. And putting something that personal and vulnerable out there is just I understand that pressure. It's just crazy. So to touch real quick on the microbiome before we leave that subject, is the basic point I'm making is really around 2012. And I know these words because I read them all the time, but I don't ever say them. But I think it's Shanji Academy of Agriculture and Sciences in China. And a guy by the name of Zhao Liebling did some of the original work on the microbiome in terms of himself. And he was using bitter melon, which is very popular in their culture, and was able through this to lose this weight, to reverse a lot of his biological symptoms. And he was using bitter melon. He was eating this gruel for a period of time and saw his body. There's really some really good coverage in around 2012 in Science Magazine. If you just look Microbiome and Me or Google some of those things, they're out there. But later, there is a really great study with kwashiorkors. And the significance here is that they were able to take discordant twins and show that it really wasn't that they were suffering a protein deficiency at all, even though protein mitigated the risk, but that when they actually cultured the microbiome of these discordant twins with presentation of kwashiorkors and then put it in sterile mice, that it actually followed their microbiome. And so that all this time we've been looking at this, yes, just like you were talking about with maybe Xanax or something like that, treating a symptom and mitigating a symptom. But in this case, it was clear the situation was actually traveling with the makeup of the microbiome, and that at some point, those infants weren't exposed to a certain environment that ended up causing them to have these issues. And so now I feel like, although I think it's been overly used in the diet community, everybody's just talking about it in sort of a generic sense. Fecal transplants, all of those kinds of things, I believe are going to be a really big part of health. And I do believe there's going to be an element of this that is also going to end up affecting mental health, to bring a full circle back to what started us on this conversation. So that's what I was referring to when I was saying that if you just eat bitter melon and look at your bloodstream, you don't see something. And I would say pre-microbiome research or pre-microbiota and general understanding we would have looked at Chinese medicine and herb as having, there wouldn't have been the prebiotic effect or the effect that this food makes, not the bacteria you're swallowing like a probiotic, but the food that you're feeding that trillions of cells that outnumber your cells in your body. And so anyway, that's why I said I think there's an analogy there, because we really didn't have an explanation. And it turns out many of those traditional things may actually have efficacy that wouldn't be measured in the old metric.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for explaining that. That makes a lot of sense. Discordant twins are twins who have lived separately. Is that what discordant means?
And they have different presentation. Yeah, so they've got these twins that one is expressing it, one of them isn't.
Expressing what? Some type of disease, like an autoimmune disease?
In this case, kwashiorkors.
Oh, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, so kwashiorkors is a disease. The name is loosely transmitted to something about the second baby, but it's a disease with sequential babies, and it's about it is believed to be caused by a sort of a competition and a limit of the amino acids critical to growth in early part of a child's life. But part of what they were thinking about is it developed based on a competition where not the baby couldn't continue to breastfeed and their diet that they replaced it with wasn't sufficient. But it's also related to microbiome as well, and that's something we've just recently learned. Mm-hmm. It used to be always seen as a protein deficiency disease. That's historically what it was. It's a lot more complicated than that. And so there was some really good research in terms of this not being a protein deficiency per se, but rather something that has to do with
something further upstream, right? The protein deficiency is a presentation of an issue.
And extra protein in the diet mitigates the symptom.
Yeah, right.
But it's not really what the cause is.
Yeah.
And the person that discovered it, her name is slipping me right now. It seems like it's like Celia or something Williams. But anyway, the person who discovered it and gave it the term in 1935 actually spent her whole life trying to disprove that it was a disease, because she later said it's not a disease. And so here as a doctor, I think she was a Jamaican doctor, but she did the ultimate in medicine, being able to name a disease, and then spent the rest of her career trying to say, wait a minute, this is something different. And then later, after she died, you get that it's actually to do with a change in the microbiome. Anyway, I didn't want to go into that much detail on that, but just the point that I wanted to make, that draw an analogy, was to the idea of us not understanding a mechanism. And what you're talking about with Mdma and psilocybin is that clearly something is happening. And just because we can't explain it doesn't mean it isn't real.
Yeah, 100%. So there are two things I take away from that. Number one is that you're telling me I should breastfeed more. Number two is that you don't have to understand the mechanism in order for something to be useful.
You don't have to be a whale to write Moby Dick.
Right. And it's important to note that there are many drugs widely prescribed, name brand, household names, the mechanisms of which we still do not entirely understand. I mean, this is true for many different drugs, and has been for certainly a very long time.
Well, look at the topic du jour, viruses. Like, look at all of what we don't know. I mean, if anything, a light should be shined on what the last few months have talked, is that finally the world knows there's so much we don't know about this, and pretending we do is not going to change the situation.
Right. I mean, we are, just as every time before us, the dark ages of 100 years from now, right? So and every really good doctor I know will say, 50% of what we know is wrong. We just don't know which 50%. And so it's important. This is also true in self-experimentation, all the more true in, let's just call it conventional science, that you don't succumb to epistemological arrogance, right? And that's a term I'm borrowing from Nassim Taleb, right. But you're thinking you know more than you actually know. or not sufficiently questioning that which you think you know.
Right. And this goes back to your point earlier, which is the process. It's the process that's so important, the questions.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we were performing surgery on infants without anesthesia. I mean, for God's sake. I mean, this is like, I mean, our history of being wrong is very consistent. And so the question is like, all right, well, what do we think of as fact now that is plausibly 10 years from now going to be completely wrong, right? And I think that a lot of psychiatry falls into that bucket, or our understanding, or better said, misunderstanding of what constitutes consciousness, an awareness that we are aware. I think we're missing half the puzzle.
I remember, you probably won't remember it as specifically because you talked to so many people about this, but it's something I remember very specifically with you at Samovar when we were having tea one time, and we were both talking about the fact that one of our best features in terms of going in this direction was that we both love to be wrong. When we're wrong, we both actually celebrate that. Where most people back up and get really uptight about being wrong, you and I both talked that day about the idea that when we're wrong, like that's the best day because you actually are learning something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even in this conversation, right? There were a number of things that you said that made no sense to me because I didn't understand them, or I didn't know the terminology, or fill in the blank. And for me, if you're only going to take at bats when you think you're going to have a home run, you're just not going to do very much. And that doesn't mean implicitly that you should condone sloppiness or allow sloppiness. That is the last thing I would ever want to recommend. And I always try to be tight in how I'm designing things or formulating hypotheses and approaches. But if you're afraid of being wrong or being shown as naive or stupid or missing some of the facts, you're just not going to do that much, right? So it's not to say that you shouldn't prepare. It's not to say that you shouldn't study diligently. It's not to say that you shouldn't work very hard to make sure that things are buttoned up. But if you're afraid of being wrong, you are going to be paralyzed. And for me, just saying I shouldn't be afraid of being wrong isn't actionable, right? I need an opposite. The opposite of that is like asking a question like, how can I celebrate when I am wrong and accept the fact that I'm wrong, right? That's very actionable. Just like stop smoking doesn't really work. If you're trying to put together an intervention for someone who's a nicotine addict, right? That is not actionable in many respects. You need a substitute. You need a sort of framework for doing things, not just the absence of doing things. And I know that I told you at the very beginning that I had, we were aiming for about an hour. I'm happy to go longer because I'm on my 2.7 glasses of wine. So if I get sloppy, then cut me off.
I love it. One of the things I've heard you say on that point more than once is this quote, and I don't know who said it, but life punishes the vague wish and rewards the specific ask. And that's kind of a different version of what you're talking about, which is it's a really going in and digging and asking those correct questions.
Yeah, that's me. I didn't get that from anyone else. Life punishes the vague wish and rewards the specific ask. Yeah, it's just something that I've seen over and over again. And for me, it always comes back to asking good questions. Because whether you're interacting with other people, whether you're interacting with the world, or thinking in your own head with that inner voice, it's really a function of asking and answering questions. A lot of our day is asking and answering questions in our own mind. And then The meta question is, what questions are you asking yourself, right? So if you ask yourself, if one of your default questions is like, what the fuck is wrong with me? Well, your mind is going to serve up answers to that question. And is that going to help or handicap? It's going to handicap you.
Yeah.
So, and trust me, that's speaking as someone who is addicted to questions like that for a very long time, multiple decades. And, therefore, if we don't want life and our minds to punish us for a vague wish, how do we convert that into a specific ask? And that is by, at least in part, asking very pointed questions.
Yeah. A point that Scott Adams, I think I introduced you guys, but Scott Adams, the comic strip Dilbert, creator of Dilbert.
Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, Scott. Yeah, thanks for that.
And then I got to meet him at your party for the first time, even though we'd known each other electronically for 15 or 20 years. But Scott had a really interesting point not too long ago, which is that opinions don't really exist. And I'm going to get this wrong, but I'll try my best to put it in here. But opinions don't exist. That opinions are basically how you're reacting to how the question's being framed. So in other words, your opinion doesn't exist outside of that. Your opinion always exists in the context of how the question's being framed. And I think when he was saying this is exactly what I was reflecting back to your questions from Tribe of Mentors, that, when you ask that question, lots of things happen. And we see this in polls. We see this all over the place, that we can change answers. We can change opinions. We can change people by how those questions are asked. So that is the most powerful tool in our toolbox. And yet it's one that a lot of time we don't spend adequate time focusing on. It's easy to react to a question, but it's much harder to act on a question.
Yeah, it is. And, part of the reason I started my podcast, I was burned out on writing books after the 4-Hour Chef, which was just a death march of a project. I mean, it was a book that I'm very, very happy with, but it was really a book that should have taken 3 or 4 years. And it was compressed into essentially a year. I mean,
that's crazy.
It was like a 100-mile sprint, and I was broken at the end of it. Love the book. I'm very proud of the book, but I was broken at the end of the process, and decided to start the podcast, meaning my podcast. God knows how long ago. I can't even remember. Let's see. It was probably 2012 or 2013. Wow, that's nuts.
Yeah.
So, 7 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, because I knew the downside was really limited. I was going to commit to 6 episodes to begin with. I was going to commit to doing 6 episodes. And at the very least, I would become better at asking questions. And that was the skill I knew would transfer to other things.
Right.
And in fact, everything. So the podcast was guaranteed to have a positive ROI if I looked at it and approached it through that lens, even if I never had any type of monetization whatsoever, which I didn't really do, I want to say, until like episode 50 or 100. I never tried to monetize it until that point. So the objective was to get better at asking questions and to fix most of my annoying verbal tics. I still have a few, but I've been able to get rid of most. And that was the driver. That was the driver behind the podcast, was to hone my ability to ask questions.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you one. So I love every week your 5-Bullet Friday. So if any person in your organization or you decide that you want to stop doing this, you immediately get my veto. Not that matters, but I'm just telling you, it's so good to have this succinct thought. And
Thanks,
every
man.
week it makes me just reflect on that day. So I look forward to it. And a quote that really stopped me recently was the one that you had in there: give more, give what you didn't get, love more, drop the old story. And you ask us to reflect on that. And I'm asking you, can you reflect out loud on that quote?
I can, on the quote. So that quote, and for people who don't have more context, is Five Bullet Friday is a newsletter that I send out every Friday. It's free. It's very popular. There are about, I don't know, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people who receive it. And if you're interested in checking it out, just go to tim.blog/Friday. I'll get off my propaganda box now. But the newsletter for me, it's 5 short bullets. It's like what I'm reading, what I'm testing, what I'm listening to, what I'm fill in the blank, right? So it could be a gadget, it could be an experiment, it could be some weird supplement, it could be a video, it could be a quote. And so I have quotes, quote I'm pondering, or poem I'm pondering in every week's edition, which goes out on Fridays. And that quote you mentioned is from Gary Shandling, the comedian, an amazing comedian, revered by many, many other comedians you would recognize who passed away. And there's I want to say HBO, but I may be getting the channel/provider wrong, in something called The Zen Diaries of Gary Shandling. And I became mesmerized. I was already a fan of Gary Shandling, but really became mesmerized by his life philosophies and approaches to life, I should say. So that quote, could you read it one more time, please?
Give more, give what you didn't get. Love more, drop the old story.
So the 2 pieces of that quote that struck me most were give what you didn't get and drop the old story. And I think they're interconnected.
Yes.
So if by giving what you didn't get, whatever that is, right? Secure attachment, consistency, reliability, love, fill in the blank, whatever that might be. That helps you to drop the old story. And similarly, by attempting to drop the old story, to give more of what you didn't get. And my life, and I think many people's lives, millions of lives, are governed by what we didn't get.
Yes.
And old stories. So my mission as of late has been attempting, whether by example or through providing tools or quotes like this, to try to grease the skids for other people to give what they didn't get and drop the old stories. Not only drop the old stories, but to write new stories for themselves.
Yeah, this is so critical. And this is critical with my weight loss clients, that they have to write a new narrative, because until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable to the one that caused the problem, one or more of those is going to dominate the plate. I mean, it's just those things are food. All food is habit. And these old stories, these old narratives that you carry about what you like and why you like it, these trap people, even people that have lots of resources.
Oh, for sure.
You had an interview with Penn. In that interview, because I think you brought out an amazing side of Penn, back to your interviewing skills and asking the right question. It was brilliant to hear him talk.
Well, thanks for making the intro, by the way.
Thank you for doing it, because what you did is showed him in a light most people I don't think see him. And it's really incredible. I mean, I feel so honored that for all these times I've had that insight and gotten to talk to him and, Tim Jennison, who introduced me to him back in the 90s.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's how I got to know him.
Yeah. Wow.
My answer to one of your 11 questions, what was something that you did that radically changed your life? What was a purchase you made? And for me, my entire life changed when I bought an Amiga computer and a video toaster, which NewTek created. And that's how I met Tim Jennison.
Right, which was Tim's company.
Yeah, this is in the early 90s. And then we became close friends. And he and I built the accelerometers for 0G for our plane, for our first flight, which kind of gets into some things I want to talk about commercial space and what's happened recently. And
Side note, if anyone hasn't seen the documentary Tim's Vermeer, go see Tim's Vermeer. Or you don't have to go anywhere. Don't go anywhere because there's too many cooties in the air. So sit at home and watch it on Amazon Prime or Netflix or wherever you can find it.
And to put this in context, I was with him the week before I was with you at Singularity. That's what I was working on. I was working on building that room with him.
That's so crazy. So now you have to explain, when you say building the room, you have to give people a little bit of context. What the hell is this movie about?
The short story here is that Tim Jennison founded a company called NewTek, and because it was a company revolutionized desktop video editing back in the 90s, and what was really interesting is because Tim is an engineer and a video engineer, when he was looking at a Vermeer, he saw a quality of these images that looked a lot like what you would see with a digital image. And Tim worked to reverse engineer how Vermeer did these paintings. And you can't imagine how complicated the sentence I just said is. So as Tim Ferriss says, watch Tim Jennison's Tim's Vermeer. But in a moment, when I was with him working on that, I was staying there and I took a picture in the bedroom I was staying in of this stack of books. And this stack of books was all of the old books he got on Vermeer to go back historically and work his way through. I mean, I won't explain the movie. You just have to watch it. So there's this stack of books. And Tim said, hey, you could do this with nutrition.
Yeah, if you think you have OCD,
yes,
watch Tim's Vermeer.
It's great.
And you will be shamed into the junior varsity.
I know. He is so good. But anyway, so Tim Jennison, I got Tim. See, he showed what he had done with this. And then I went back with this challenge that came really from your book, and from your book being published and all these people suddenly criticizing me publicly, which I didn't sign up for that part. I just was telling the story about being silly.
In fairness, there were also a bunch of fans. It wasn't all criticism, but there were plenty of critics.
But, you're not thinking about this stuff. You're not thinking about someone coming out and just completely slamming you. It's like, look, I'm just telling a story about my stupid idea shivering and being cold. But what I learned from Tim was that if you go back to history and reread it and you know how the story ends, that suddenly it means a totally different thing. And that started my obsession with calorie and with all of this, which ended up with the metabolic winter hypothesis and oxidative priority and even health span solution, the cookbook we just had. But it all goes back to that point. And that, if I had never bought that video toaster, none of this probably would have happened. 0G was partially related to that because Peter Diamandis and Byron Lichtenberg and I used my video toaster to make all these demo videos that we were using to get investors, because people thought what we were doing is crazy. They thought the X Prize was crazy. And we did the original X Prize animations on Lightwave 3D, which is a product Tim made. So, and Tim was very supportive of all what we're doing. So was Penn and Teller, which was really great. So my point of all this was to say that in terms of one of your 11 questions, is there a purchase? And that one absolutely changed my life. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. It changed everything I was doing. And then full circle to come around and realize it, because I'm reading through your questions when that book came out, I'm thinking, that's really the answer to that. So in terms of space and commercial space, you got to fly on 0G, is that correct?
Oh, yeah, I did indeed.
Going back again to our meeting at Singularity University, and Elon was really making his flight that night or that week, July 14th, 13th, something like that, 2009, that was his make or break. I mean, had it not gone successful, SpaceX would have been over. What do you think over the last 10 years about the fact that space travel might actually be released as sort of an economic exothermic reaction, that we might actually be able to have space travel as a permanent part of the commercial world where it's traditionally been governed only by governments?
I think it's rad. not to get too technical, but I think it's extremely exciting. In fact, when I was on my zero-G flight, two of the people there were Elon Musk and James Cameron.
Yes.
And I remember thinking to myself, God forbid this pilot screws this up and these guys drop from like 6 feet in the air onto their heads, because this is a really valuable payload in this tube that is flying through the sky right now. And I am extremely excited about it. With disclosure, I have to say that I'm, through a fund, an investor in SpaceX. The fund exists solely for SpaceX. So there is that. But I'm excited about not just commercial space flight, or I suppose more attractively put, private space flight, but the competition. I think competition is good. And I love the vision of Elon Musk, the visions, I should say. And I also love the visions of, say, Jeff Bezos.
Right.
And I have no dog in the fight with Bezos. But when he is looking at his, or describing his cities in the sky, which are not too dissimilar from the Matt Damon movie that I'm blanking on right now. Starts with an E, I want to say. It's Elysium.
Oh, okay, yeah, Elysium.
Elysium. I say let the best one win, right? I mean, I'm very excited about that. And I don't have much to add, since I'm not a specialist in private space aviation, but the ability to go from New York to Shanghai in 30 minutes, I'm in.
Yeah.
I mean, what's not to like? Yeah. Now, that having been said, do I want to be one of the first 200 monkeys shot into space? Probably not. I'll hold off and make sure they work through the O-rings and any other specifics that need to be dialed before we have say domestic travel like safety assurances, but I'm very excited about it.
Well, one of the things I think you ought to also be excited about is, I don't know if you know who Tabor McCallum and Jane Poynter are, but I interviewed them. They were two of the Biospherians in the first crew on Biosphere 2, and they recently launched their company again, which is called Space Perspectives. You've got to look this up, because I expect a Tim Ferriss party in one of these capsules where they go up in a high altitude balloon and they float around for 6 hours and then you come back. I expect that. And I also expect an invitation when you put on one of your amazing Tim Ferriss parties, because I've been to several of them and they're always incredible. But when you have a space perspective party, I really want to be on that invite list, but it's something you should look at for sure, because it's kind of a really great concept. It's not that risky if you think about it. You take a capsule, put it on a big pressurized vessel, put it with lots of windows and lift it up above the atmosphere, and suddenly, it's relatively safe. I mean, you've got a parachute to come down. It's not like it's really that much risk other than, pressurization, but that's easy to do. It's a lot more safe than going underwater, if you think about it. So it's something you definitely should look at. Sounds fun to me. Yeah. So
I'm into it.
To pivot, the one thing I think everybody probably wants to hear, because they see us and connected with the cold stress, and they know that I'm doing this plant-based diet thing and you're doing this ketogenic diet, it would be just like succinctly tell us where you are right now with your concept of diet, where you think things are. And I'll also present where I think things are, and we can maybe look at that and see where the overlap is and where the differences are.
Sure. I think you are, I will concede defeat in advance and just say that I think you are much more meticulous and sophisticated with your assessment of diet. So let me just start there. And then I want to zoom out and also answer or address this from the perspective of longevity before I get to diet. And I will say that in my mind, I've come to value the psycho-emotional input as a determinant of longevity as much as that of diet, right? So if you're waking up every day and you're hyper vigilant and have every which way of fucked up in heart rate variability all day long because you're overreacting to minor stressors, I don't think whether you have animal protein or no protein is going to be the primary determinant of when you die. So in my case, that has become an overarching focus, is really contemplating and navigating my base physiological response to daily existence, right? And I don't have 17 studies to link to prove that this is a determinant, but I at least at this point, through direct experience, feel like it's fairly common or uncommon sense. From a dietary perspective, I don't think that, just to establish my position, I don't know if I have a position, but let's pretend like I do, that ketogenic is the church whose altar I worship at, in the sense that the ketogenic diet, I think, is very, very useful for a number of specific circumstances. I think it's very helpful for certain types of cancer. I think it is very helpful for those suffering from autoimmune disorders.
Epilepsy.
Not all, but yeah, epilepsy. Certainly, if we're looking at the origins of the ketogenic diet in modern Western science, it was designed using heavy cream predominantly in the treatment of epileptic children. And there are certain disease states that you would wish to avoid or to treat that are addressed very well with the ketogenic diet, which, for those who don't know, is, let's just call it high fat, meaning 70-80+% of your calories from fat, very moderate protein, and next to non-existent carbohydrates. Dietarily, for me currently, I would say I have a heavy whole food bias, so I'm not supplementing heavily. And I tend to lean in the paleo or slow carb direction, which means really I am avoiding refined carbohydrates. Do I sometimes succumb and eat donuts and all that crap? Yes, I do, because they're delicious. But most of the time, right, over the last, just say, week, what have I been eating? I've been eating legumes. I've been eating lentils, broccoli, venison. I've been eating unsweetened, whole fat, local yogurt, right? And you could argue that lactose is insulinogenetic. Is that the right word? No, it's not the word I'm looking for. But even though it has a low, even though it has a insulinogenic, even though it has a low glycemic index or glycemic load, it still has a strong effect on insulin response.
Yeah, just like isoleucine, it's the same way as an amino acid, does the same thing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. So if you're looking for maximum muscular hypertrophy, then hey, maybe isoleucine is what you want at a certain point in a window post-workout. But I'm exercising on a daily basis and consuming what you might consider predominantly paleo. And I am using how well I sleep and how I feel as a barometer for what I should eat or not eat. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention that as we're having this conversation, I just drank 3/4 of a bottle of red Burgundy wine, right? So is that good for me? Can I justify that talking about sirtuin activation of resveratrol? You got to be fucking, you got to be fucking kidding me, because you have to drink 48 cases or whatever the hell it is, right? But I do think that for me, I do pay attention to longevity, but no matter what has happened for my male predecessors in my family lineage, they have all died on average at 85. That's it. End of story. So I would love to live longer than 85, but I recognize, I think, for me at least, that there's a point of diminishing returns where your quest for eternal life becomes a severe handicap in the life that you have been gifted. And for that reason, I pay attention, but I do want to, aside from lifespan, pay attention to performance span and psychological well-being.
Health span. You want to live longer, not live longer. You want to enjoy all those lives and be cognitive, ambulatory. You want to have the best part. And really, this ties back to the 4-hour work week, because the 2 words or 3 words that I took away from 4-hour work week that were very much something that I focused on was the deferred life plan. And in some sense, this is what we're talking about here. One of the issues with longevity research when people are talking about it is they think about adding 3 years at the end when they're not living a good life. But really what health span and what the totality of the research says is that you're expanding those quality years. And that's really what I hear you saying in what you're talking about with your approach.
That's right. And I don't know if I'm doing it correctly. I'm trying to approach it as thoughtfully as I can. I'm sitting on a farm right now. I'm in the middle of the wilderness. It's raining outside. I'm drinking some wine. I feel fucking great now. And I don't drink that much. I'm enjoying this conversation. And I will just say that whether it's 60 years, 80 years, 100 years, or 150 years, everyone listening to this is going to die. We're both going to die. And from the standpoint of the lifespan of this planet or the universe, I mean, that is less than the blink of an eye. It is a flickering of the light in the darkness. It is so short. And, one of the benefits of having experiences, whether psychedelically enhanced or otherwise, where you are able to experience non-ordinary reality without time, and in some cases without space or self, is you lose a lot of your fear related to death. And I know I'm taking it in a strange direction, but it's not that strange. I mean, it's actually the opposite of strange. This is a perennial, eternal conundrum that people consider and consternate over and suffer through.
Yeah, that idea that humans can think about and contemplate their death puts them in a really different situation than many other organisms that likely can't, because they don't have that higher level cognitive skill.
Yeah. I mean, whether it's skill or liability. Right?
That's right. That's a good point.
We are.
We're all gonna die, man.
we have developed. Yeah, that's a shitty, in some way, like a shitty little corner of evolution that we've painted ourselves into somehow, right? Because we are, through natural selection, evolved to have whatever faculties we currently possess, and they are not optimized for happiness. They are not optimized for contentedness. They are optimized for the furtherance and procreation of the species, period. Full stop. That's it. And when you realize that, I think you can begin to take stock of yourself as a flawed being, as is everything in this world, and appreciate the brief span of time that we get to enjoy on this planet. And it could be the wine talking, so if I'm sounding like complete horseshit, please let me know. But I'm just looking outside right now, and it's so stunningly beautiful. I mean, I'm looking out on tons of land, an abandoned horse paddock with a run-in barn, with the rain coming down, with green surrounding everything. And if I can't hit pause on my future planning and future tripping and anxiety of things yet to come to enjoy this conversation right now with my bottle of wine and my dog sitting next to me with this rain coming down, what is the point of having another 3 years?
Right.
There is no point.
Yeah.
There's very little point. So these are the things that occupy my thoughts.
Right. So if I launch off of that, the more poetic side of that, what I would say that I've come...
Please do. Please do.
Yeah, because I think this is a really better way to frame it other than some macronutrient list or some of the crazy stuff. You got to have a biochemistry degree to shop at Whole Foods. This is silly. But if I were to sort of present it in a similar way, what I have come to understand over the last decade, because of meeting you and because of you getting thrust into this where I needed to look, and because of my own issue with type 2 diabetes that I had to reverse. My argument would be that, or my concept would be that, essentially animals and plants concentrate nutrition in a fundamentally different way. Animals, in a sense, appropriate nutrition where plants create it through biosynthesis. And when we look across the breadth of longevity and health span research, the one thing that sticks out is that dietary restriction without malnutrition or eliminating superfluous nutrition is maybe another way to say that.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
That likely signals protective mechanisms to preserve the organism for a better time to reproduce for offspring survival. In other words, what you were talking about, the idea behind paleo really comes down to this eat and mate, that's what it is. So we can eat many things and reach reproductive age, navigate the 15 or 20 years of reproductive prime, and raise our youngest offspring. But sometime around 45 or 50, back to your numbers, evolution is done with us. And we've already passed on our genes for those people who are hunting for some evolutionary diet. It doesn't have a feedback loop, so maybe the grandmother's hypothesis. But unfortunately, all of our nutrition recommendations and science is centered on overcoming economic scarcity due to our species being able to sort of reproduce in ways that outstrip normal food access. One of the things I learned about going back and looking at all the Atwater's work and looking at all this is the idea was they were trying to overcome economic scarcity. So everything we do in dietetics is based on being deficient in something. And yet, if you really look at it, getting enough may have been the challenge for millennia, but now chronic overnutrition is probably one of the biggest obstacles. Most of today's nutritional related disease is because of excessive nutrition of one kind or the other, whether you're a fat advocate or a starch and sugar advocate, whatever it matters, it's always that you're eating too much of something. It's not that you're not eating enough of something. So when David Sinclair and Andrew Bremer and I came up with the food triangle, which has at its top, leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, things that nobody really complains about. And then down one descending side has animal-sourced nutrition, and the other side has plant-sourced nutrition. What I believe is that eating on that right side of that food triangle versus, for example, bottom feeding, steak and potato, burger and fry, pasta and meat sauce, curry and rice, that's the best thing to do if you barely have enough to eat, because you use the glucose now and you save the fat to later. Our problem is later never comes. But I think eating on the right side of the food triangle likely decreases fecundity. You may not win the race, but you brought that up as the idea of optimizing for sports. So we're talking about longevity and health span, but it also is probably the easiest way to invoke those evolutionary survival genes that preserve us for a better time for reproduction. So in that sense, when I'm recommending a plant-based diet, it's not about superfoods and it's not about concentrating nutrition. It's about limiting overall nutrition without being deficient. And the salient element isn't that the food is made from plants, because the whatever burgers that are out now and beef are both made from plants, if you really want to come down to it. Whether you extract it from a pea protein or whatever and do it in lab, it may have environmental impacts, but I'm not considering this part in terms of the diet. But the idea is, if you construct something that biologically signals just the way something else biological signals, you brought up, we were talking about isoleucine, or all the branch chain amino acids, valine, leucine, isoleucine, methionine, all of these things we know have issues, and too much of them probably are great for go grow when you're young, and probably not so good later in life. When we talked about insulin, the anabolic axis of IGF-1 and growth hormone and insulin, these are all critical for the kinds of growth and the kinds of performance you were talking about in the 4-hour body. But that could be both true, and they could limit how your health is later down the road. So I would argue that we've already seen a decline in now what's called plant-based or vegan labels, and that now it's just the food industry is selling, as Penn called it, the 3 chords of rock and roll, sugar, salt, and oil. You know, they're just selling that decadence and those evolutionary hits, right? You know, C, G, and F, or whatever those chords are, right? So eating a higher volume of plant-based food that's closer to the state that you would get it off that farm you're on, likely is helping one do that dietary restriction without malnutrition that we've seen successful from yeast to primates. And then that last part, which you talked about, which is the enjoyment and what we love. I think one of the things that, if I've learned any lesson from you with your teaching, is that we can change our habits. And our new favorite food, we can create that. I don't need to eat another cheeseburger ever again. I've had them. I know what they're like. I'm not opposed to them. I don't care if other people eat them. I can get a similar experience out of a bowl of hamburger rice, you know, which is just some black rice with a little of my own mayo that's not eggs and not, you know, all that. I make it. A little bit of ketchup, a little bit of mustard, a little bit of Wickles relish. I love Wickles relish. I put some fresh onions on it and some tomatoes.
What the hell is Wickles relish?
Wickles are it's spicy pickles. It's like spicy bread and butter chips, but anyway, it's a relish that's very spicy.
Yum.
I just like the spicy side. And when I'm eating a bowl of this with the texture of that black rice, it is as if I was eating a hamburger, because all the flavors are the same. And I can eat it, and it doesn't matter how much of it I eat, really. I'm not going to overeat doing that. And I get the experience. So what I've done is divide food into what's the experience you're going after, and then what's the health. And if I can move more of my 10 experiences that were 2 on the health scale up to an 8 or 9 experience and 7 or 8 on the health scale, I would say that I'm doing what you're doing in a different way, but trying to accomplish the same thing. I mean, I've never been a smoker, and I don't feel deprived of cigarettes. And right now, I don't feel deprived of some of the animal products that I ate in the past. Now, if I want to, since it's an ideology to me, if I want to have some sushi with my son, I can do that, right? But I find that it's something that concept that even Penn talked about, rare and appropriate. And rare and appropriate is about people and places, not time between events. And so you find yourself in a small temple in China, and even though it's Buddhist and maybe there's some shrimp paste, but even though, you know, obviously a lot of that stuff is all vegan to begin with, but I'm not going to argue over that. It doesn't matter that it has sugar or even oil or salt. I mean, gosh, traveling in Thailand and China, it's going to be a hard time for me to avoid salt. I do know that it causes my blood pressure to go up, and I never had blood pressure problems, but I can also fix it as soon as I get home. So my point is, I feel like I'm coming at this from the same perspective as you are, which is maximizing the experience. But I also think I'm utilizing what I learned from you, which is I've now upgraded my experience and I don't feel like I'm missing out on anything. Where maybe you're continuing to do those other things for fear of missing out, I feel like there's a role to modify that slightly. How would you react to that?
Well, I would say that was one hell of a TED Talk.
God, I'm so glad I got you after wine, because this wouldn't be fair if I was having to deal with you.
Yeah.
But no, this is really good, because people really think we disagree on everything, but I don't think we're that far apart.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I do feel like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest after a bottle of wine, which now I'm approaching, but... so that's shame on me for that. I can't blame you for forcing, you're not waterboarding me with wine or anything. But here's what I would say. Number one is...
I got to pay something off there.
Number one is...
Keep feeding him wine, because I'm going to make it go long, and I need some fair, an equalizer.
Oh, you're fine. I think you can compete just fine. And number one is... what I would suggest is be aware of where you're starting. And that is, well, let me preface that by saying, like, whatever you do, you should feel good about doing. And that sounds so Hallmark card, but do you actually feel good about how you are eating? I can check in on that question. If you really pause, if one pauses to ask, you will get a clear answer. And so let's start with that. For me, as a meat eater, which I should say is somewhat predicated on my relationship to death and my value judgment related to death, in so much as I do not view death as inherently a negative thing. And life and death, for me, at this point, philosophically and experientially, are sides of the same coin. So if I look in my refrigerator, and it's, for me right now, almost 8 o'clock, we were going to end 48 minutes ago, and I'm fine to continue, so don't worry. But my dinner is going to be axis deer, this is venison, from Hawaii, through a company named Maui Nui. So Maui, like the island, N-U-I, Nui, which I ended up investing in. Axis deer are an invasive species on Maui. They've destroyed a lot of the ecosystem. They have damaged the coral reef by means of runoff. And without natural predators, since this species was introduced, humans need to think about management. They're the only ones in a position to manage this species. And I feel very good from an ethical perspective about eating axis deer, which happen to be like the Arnold Schwarzenegger of deer. They're very, very lean. And I feel psychologically, physically excellent when I consume this protein. Some garlic aioli from Primal Kitchen, from Mark Sisson, or previously from Mark Sisson before the acquisition. And then I'll have some local broccoli or snap peas, and that'll probably be it. Very simple meal, not too high in vegetable protein. I have gone, for instance, last week I was entirely vegetarian, didn't eat any animal protein aside from, let's call it, well, it was exclusive to eggs, really. I was eating soft-boiled eggs. And so number one is, where are you starting? And the reason I bring all this up is that if you begin with eating animals is wrong is because it involves killing, you have limited yourself to only a few paths of logic and reasoning, if that makes any sense, right? So if you're starting with that, it's really important to recognize that so you don't conflate it with biochemical reasoning. Does that make sense? And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but if you're making an ethical judgment, recognize that as an ethical judgment, not a evolutionary or biochemical judgment. I think that's really important.
Right.
Second is how you feel about how you're eating. Right? How do you really feel about how you're eating? And for me, I have realized that I can go weeks without eating. And I have gone weeks without eating. I can go weeks without eating animal protein. I just happen personally to feel better when I'm eating to a certain percentage of my caloric input ethically sourced animal protein. I do feel good. And that doesn't mean I'll live longer. Maybe I will live 5 years shorter than I would otherwise. But on a daily basis, from a mental, from a physical, from a psychological and emotional perspective, I seem to feel better. And I don't need an explanation for that. I don't need to slice that, because at this point, really it comes down to today, was it a -1, a 0, or a +1? And if I add up those days that are +1, what are the patterns that I spot? And that's not to say I advise a carnivore diet, although I'm kind of interested in the extremity of that type of experiment, right? Where you're only eating ribeyes for a month straight. Like, I'm interested in what would happen. And maybe at some point I'll do that. I kind of already did that actually for the 4 Hour Body, where I ate mixed nuts and steak for a month and saw all these interesting blood marker changes. But as you mentioned, it's not just blood markers, right? Like, the things that are easiest to measure are not necessarily the only important things to measure, which is why, assuming we have an insufficiency of understanding about these things, the simplest way for me to try to get a beat on things is to ask, was today -1, 0, or +1, right? -1, kind of a negative tenor day, 0, kind of neutral, nothing outstanding, or +1, a positive day. And in the cases of those positives, I can look at patterns. In the case of those negative ones, I can also look at patterns, right? Because you might have a dozen donuts and say, fuck yeah, I'm winning the universe. This is great. I love Dunkin' Donuts. And no mistake, there are days when I want to have donuts, and we'll have donuts. I'm not going to apologize for that. But the next day, I will have a tax to pay. And it's important to factor that into my evaluation of that one day when I happen to down 12 donuts and crullers and all the other delicious things that I like. So I'm meandering a little bit, but that is to say, the two questions I think are very important are, number one, where are you starting? And what is your base assumption that is dictating your train of reasoning? That's very important to assess. And number two, like, how do you really feel about how you're eating? Because if you talk to someone, as you have, with someone who is morbidly obese or very obese, they, at the heart of it, know that they are eating like a fat person. They have a degree of shame, likely. This is not always the case, but often the case. They have a degree of shame and weight that they carry about how they are eating. There is an awareness. There's a base level of an awareness. But I'll stop there and let you pick up.
Let me start with that last point, which is what I tell those people is I get them to do away with any kind of shame. We actually make everything funny. And I say, basically, you're not broken. Most of the vices or problems we perceive are evolutionary advantages gone awry, and they're probably better explained by cultural and social norms outpacing genetics. And appetite is probably not a trait of negative selection in a calorie-scarce world.
What do you mean by that?
In nature, where calories are scarce, appetite is a really positive thing to have. You come along and you find food, you better eat a lot of it. But now it's maladaptive because we're in a world of excess access. And the access to food is the issue, not the appetite. And everybody's focused on mitigating willpower, which you heard Penn tell you. How can you turn off those appetite cues? And what I believe I've been able to do with several hundred clients, it's not a huge number, but it's a lot, and you've seen some of the results. What I've been able to do is invoke those, what I would call metabolic winter genes, cool, dark, still, and scarce, which I would say are hallmarks of survival for a time when metabolic summer, bright, warm, active, and abundant, which is something that makes you feel good and explains what your approach is, would be for fecundity and reproduction. So I feel, I don't disagree that you probably do feel good eating that.
Now, can I pause for a second?
Go ahead.
As much as I like to be fecund, hold on one second. I also fast regularly for 3 to 10 days. So I am not all on all the time. I think this is important to note.
No, this is rare and appropriate for me. It would be the same thing. I absolutely agree with that. Like, all I'm saying is that what people feel when they're eating food in a repetitive way, I would predict a lot of them would actually feel better in things that would make us far more likely to reproduce and increase fecundity, right? And so what I do with those clients and what they've been able to do is find those new favorite foods and just relegate those kinds of things like what you're talking about, the venison, to sort of the rare and appropriate occasion. And what does that mean? Well, what I think it means for me, I don't have type 2 diabetes. I don't have poor glucose control. I have a good hemoglobin A1C score, but I eat almost exclusively rice and potatoes and corn and legumes. If you go and if you take traffic tickets and accidents as biomarkers for a bad driver, and you take away the car or the carb, you take away the car, and then look at their driving record in 6 months and say, oh, wow, look at these are great. I feel like that's what's going on right now in the quote-unquote, I don't use protein, carbs, and fat as food groups, but that's what's going on in the low-carb world. Whereas, on the other hand, if you're eating almost exclusively starches and sugars that are in fruits, and all of those biomarkers still get better, one needs to ask, okay, why is it that I couldn't control my blood glucose when I was eating limited amounts of, because the last 3 things I got rid of, and you were there when that conversation happened with Dean Ornish, TEDMed in 2009, was salmon, or occasionally sushi, eggs, yogurt, and cottage cheese, because I was doing the yogurt and cottage cheese thing from the Bill Phillips days, right? I still to this day, I love that. I don't eat it, but I love it. My point is, when I eliminated those within 45 days, my glucose came in control, and my hemoglobin A1C came into control, and I didn't eliminate any fruits or any starches. In fact, I was eating a lot more of them. Now, it sucked at that time, because for the first 2 months that I did this, and I started November 23rd, 2009, the week before Thanksgiving, and I did it for 1 whole year until your book came out. I did not have any animal products until your book came out. And then when that came out, I did slow carb for a while, and all of my stuff came back for me. But I do know that I think if I would have gone all that way and eliminated the starches and the fruits and a lot of the simple sugars, as a lot of these people have done, my biomarkers may have corrected. But like you said early, what does that mean? And if they're biomarkers testing your response to dietary carbohydrate and you've eliminated dietary carbohydrate, what are you really celebrating? I'm a good driver, but I don't have a car, right? My driving record's perfect. That's the way I put it. But getting back to this enjoyment side, I feel like the food triangle, when we look at it, you're eating down the left side of the food triangle, and you're limiting that bottom left sum. You're not just all out like you're saying. But what you're also doing is you're probably limiting on the right side of the food triangle. Those probably, excessive starchy, excessive grains, excessive things, that's creating a balance. And what the food triangle predicts is that if you eat on the left or eat on the right, it's going to be better than bottom feeding, eating along the bottom, steak and potatoes, burgers and fries. So I feel like It's consistent with our two papers, Metabolic Winter Hypothesis and Oxidative Priority, in terms of predicting weight gain or weight maintenance. It's consistent with dietary restriction without malnutrition, meaning one could probably do it on the left side. I mean, David Sinclair isn't a vegan, right? But he does lean heavily. And one of the things, he didn't push as hard when his book was going around because that was not the thesis of his book, wasn't really centered on diet. But he does try to lean on that side. Peter is now leaning on that side in terms of just eating more plant products and just not eating those as often.
He also eats a lot of axis steer. But yes, Peter and Tia, you mean, right? He also eats it.
No, I'm talking about Peter Diamandis. Sorry.
Diamandis.
Peter
Sorry.
Diamandis.
Sorry.
Yeah, Peter is moved over. Yeah.
Got it.
He's moved over. Sorry. Different Peter. Peter, Tim, talk, right? Wasn't that what Kevin made the joke?
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. Kevin.
I don't know where that memory just popped up. But
good.
Peter. No, it's Tim, talk. And you should have gone with that name.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Kevin on the first episode of my podcast, so I now have 500 episodes. Or whatever the fuck it is, 450, said, well, you don't have a name. We should call it Tim Talk. And I've been hearing about Tim Talk ever since for 6 years. Yeah.
We're never going to let you forget.
That's okay.
Right? You need
that's
to
good.
do your merch line, Tim Talk shirts. So we all have it. Maybe I should do it and I can pay my daughter's college fund with my Tim Talk shirts, right? So what I'm going with this is I feel like the food triangle predicts the results you're having. And yes, it may lead to some of those health span issues or the aggregation of chronic disease. However, what I also can't say, because I don't know whether it's true or not, is your consistent longer-term fasting could mitigate all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Meaning, those times of metabolic winter may in fact do it. And then to go a step further, what I also can't preclude is the work that David's doing with pharmacological intervention to activate those sirtuin genes and other longevity pathways, might be able to do it regardless of what you eat.
Yeah.
Right? So we have all of those that can coexist. And I think because both you and I approach this in a non-ideological way, and that we're approaching it with what's the best available evidence, I believe that a whole food plant-based diet, eating on the right side of the food triangle, is probably the highest volume, most enjoyable way, with the caveat that you have to develop those new habits, those new loves of food, to deal with a lot of the age-related chronic disease. As well, I think that the paleo, which would be mostly a left side eating on the food triangle, it would be left side eating. I think that that's probably a huge improvement over bottom feeding, which is how, if I go back to Eliza Acton and my cookbooks from the mid-19th century, when they started becoming available, and her call to eat to live instead of just making everything exciting. So it's not a new problem. I think that probably her work, Eustace von Liebig's work, and some of the others, probably bottom feeding, constructing recipes that historically starchy and animal fat based, when calories were economically or environmentally scarce, was probably one of the most efficient mechanisms to feed this apex predator. So all of those things could be true at the same time, and what you decide to optimize on is what I heard you saying. You were optimizing on some other things, but I fully believe that if you and I were in the kitchen together and we started working on, okay, what's Tim's palate, and we started cooking and putting our skills to there, you could make an entirely enjoyable meal on the plant-based side, and you would love it. At the same time, I mean, obviously, I know about the 7 animal product ingredients, and I used to grill and do all those things, and I know how they taste and flavor, and it's just a lot easier for me to move over on this side. How's that for taking it right down the middle?
Well, I would say, there are a whole lot of ways to approach this, right? And I have experimented with plant-based eating. Mm-hmm. There are lest people think that the 4-hour body is all meat. It is not. There are a few chapters on
No, legumes were very important.
legumes, and also I think it was called The Plant-Based Machine, where I interviewed Scott Jurek, who is a Western States 100 running champion, one of the most dominant running, long distance, meaning ultra endurance runners of all time, about his vegan-based eating plan. I think that there are many paths to travel, and I have eaten for extended periods as a vegetarian or vegan before. And one of my favorite cookbooks is the First Mess Cookbook, subtitled Vibrant Plant-Based Recipes to Eat Well Through the Seasons. It's a fucking fantastic book by Laura Wright. And I was introduced to a lot of that during a Vipassana meditation retreat where everything was vegetarian. This is at Spirit Rock in Northern California. And I want to ask you how much of your plant-based drive, if any, is ethically driven?
Zero. In fact, I'm
zero.
I have a really difficult time because a lot of the vegan community doesn't accept what I'm doing because I'm doing it for the wrong reason. Not everybody. I mean, I've been embraced by a lot of people because obviously I work with a lot of them, but absolutely zero. I am not ethical in any way about it. I think that there is probably ways to eat animals and not be cruel. I think anybody wants to be cruel to anything. And I don't know that when I was growing up with my cattle farm up in southern Tennessee that we were being unnecessarily cruel. With that said, I understand what their argument is, and I get it. It's okay. I understand that a person doesn't want to do it, but no, I'm not ethical about that. I want to put the human back into humane. What I would like to see the vegan community too, and what I would challenge them to do, is to care as much about the humans that are being made sick by chronic overnutrition, and to care enough about that as opposed to just creating animal-free junk food, which is where the direction, I think, and I think it's a failed philosophy if you push everything to the animal-free junk food and then people get sick. But, they're getting sick and it's their choice. I don't think people have a choice until the new diet is equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable to the one that caused the problem. One or more of those will likely dominate the plate. So I think one of the unintended consequences, because I don't think anybody's doing this purposefully, it's an unintended consequence. But the ethical argument says, okay, I'm not going to eat animals at all costs, and that's okay. If somebody has that value, I can understand that. I can see that. But then to go to the next thing and to say, okay, I'm going to purposely promote foods that I know to be very unhealthy, just to bait and switch a bunch of meat eaters to not eat meat. I don't like that approach. Now, I'm saying it in a callous way. I really honestly don't, for my vegan people that are out there, they all know that I'm not trying to criticize what the effort is or what they're trying to accomplish. But what I am saying is that I feel that we need to put the human back into humane, and the amount of suffering that happens during those last years of life, and when people start to get this onset of age-related chronic disease, which in part is due to chronic overnutrition, which is in part due to the diet of affluence, which normally, when we go from peasant food to royalty food, it becomes increased animal concentration. It's not the rice that's giving the Chinese all their diabetes right now that they're seeing a surge in. It's not the rice that the Thais are being told, don't eat this rice. The rice they've been eating for a long time and never having diabetes. It's not. And I know that with me, it's not the rice that does it for me. So that's my point on the ethical thing. It would just be that I think the whole conversation needs to change. And since I don't do the whole environmental thing, I don't make any of my decisions based on water and land use and carbon dioxide or any of those things. I'm focused on one thing that I can research and do something about, which is what is the best and most tasty option for implementing dietary restriction without malnutrition and being inspired to go back to culinary school to do that. And by the way, I'm going to have to self-plug here. I never self-plug. Everybody says you got to plug things. So you have to also plug, in terms of plant-based cookbooks, you have to also plug the HealthSpan Solution, which is our book that came out with Juliana Heber. You got to put that one in there too. So, but I really believe that.
Check it out.
Yeah, but I believe from that perspective that the ethical side is not really my motivator, or the environmental side, or those things. I really think that this is the best opportunity to have, but it does require developing new habits. But like I said earlier, I chalk that up to what I learned from you all along, which is that we actually can learn to do these things, and that you're not destined to only feel good with venison. And that may be because of the feckin. So I'm not talking about that part of it. I'm just saying that on average, when you look at that whole thing, I believe you could make some of those changes if you had the desire to. And obviously at this point, that's not, in terms of your cost benefit, that's not where you're putting your main drive. For me, it was necessary because those last 3 animal products were causing my issue. And it was one where I was passing out after meals and I was having all those symptoms. And now, a decade or more later, I don't have those issues. And remember, my issues got worse after I lost weight. My issues got worse after that experiment that you talk about in your book. That's when it got really bad. So I was at normal weight. And then for our clients, their blood pressure, their blood glucose, all those things normalize before their weight loss is gone. One of our clients off of her blood pressure medicine, and then her thyroid medicine, which she's been on since graduate school, cut in half within 60 pounds, and she still has quite a bit left to go, 50 or 60 pounds left to go, but they get better before they've lost the weight. And to me, that says that maybe obesity and these chronic diseases are symptoms of the same diet, and they're associated and travel with, but even though there may be some maladaptive components, they may not be directly causal.
Yep, I think that's entirely possible. I would say a few things. Number one, just for people who don't have a visual on the food triangle, I'm looking at a diagram here. This is from you. And at the top, you have leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, stems, bulbs, mushrooms, and then you imagine 2 stems going down to the bottom 2 sides of the triangle. And this varies depending on which view you have, but in the, let's just call it paleo perspective,
left side,
you have bottom left, exactly, the bottom left side, right? So imagine a triangle. You have meat, eggs, dairy, poultry, fish, shellfish, and then in parentheses, that would all be fat, right? For a vegetarian, that would be eggs, dairy.
As the increasing energy density.
Right. And for a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, you would have eggs, dairy, nuts, seeds, avocado, coconut. On the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side, you would have nuts and seeds, and then fruits, cereals, pulses, legumes, in other words, starchy vegetables, carbohydrates. So that is one way to think about this. I would like to add a few things. Number one is, and this is going to sound very, very strange to a lot of folks, if you think that plants don't suffer, if your beginning point is an ethical one, if your base premise is one of ethics, if you think that plants don't suffer, you haven't spent enough time with plants. I just want to put that out there as a very strange offering. That's number one. Number two is clarifying the pyramid that you alluded to, just for those who don't have visual reference.
We do triangles, not pyramids. There's no pyramids here. That's the USDA.
There we go. All right, sorry. Triangles.
Come on. Where's my They Might Be Giants fan? Triangle man, right?
But my dog is coming up and checking with me on the rain and the food. Yeah. I know you want to eat, Molly. My dog Molly didn't have any breakfast because she was being too picky about her food, so she didn't have any breakfast. So Molly and I are both intermittent fasting on the regular. And I would say that as a third point, there are very few people who could not benefit from some pre-scheduled regular fasting period. And to me, that does not mean 18 hours. Obviously, speak to your medical professional. I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on the internet. But a fast of 3 to 7 days, one that is sufficient to trigger autophagy and other processes that can greatly, I think, mitigate longevity risk and benefit the organism, so to speak, lead me to believe, at least, that fasting addresses a whole host of ills. And you and I have different approaches, although I think there's a lot of shared DNA and a lot of shared philosophy. But at the end of the day, it's how you feel. How do you feel when you wake up? And how easily do you go to sleep? That's it. When you wake up, is it anxiety? Or is it easeful restfulness?
Right.
When you go to bed, is it less than 20 minutes to go to sleep? Or is it 45 minutes of ruminating or more of thinking about your worries and to-do list?
Or you got to take a drug every night to fall asleep.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is a very simple, some would say simplistic way of assessing how well what you are doing is working.
Right. So my response would be that, and I agree that how you feel is important. I would first echo what you're saying, that less time in the fed state, the way we describe in the oxidative priority paper, meaning the amount of time being in the chronically fed state with the idea of postprandial, the 4 to 6 hours after you've eaten, not just when the eating event is, but it goes on. So I think less time in the fed state is probably going to be beneficial for those repair mechanisms in the same way sleep helps in consolidating memories and other kinds of things. Your brain isn't inactive, it's doing different things. Whenever we eat, whether it's a handful of M&Ms or a big Thanksgiving dinner, it likely triggers lots of triage level events that say, hey, nutrition's emergency. I'm having an eating event. This is now the top priority. Whereas the fasted state is about conservation. It's not about anabolic. It's not about all that growth. It's about metabolic house cleaning, to just sort of make the analogy, the loose analogy to sleep. So I think you're right. Both of those things are important. So eat less often. And then I also believe a lot of people would benefit from having more plants in their diet in general. So as you're eating more fruits and vegetables in general, and that was the advice of Eliza Acton in 1858 in her cookbook, is like, just getting more vegetables and more fruit. That actually, I'll say this, for a vegan diet, eating exclusively plants is probably a luxury, an economic luxury, because it probably was pretty difficult to do not that long ago. And so I see it as an opportunity to do it, but none of the ideology arguments persuade me, because I just want to selfishly live long and die fast if I have to die at all. I still hope that I'm ahead of the curve, and that we actually get to, Peter D. Mandis and I always used to say back in the early days was, we wanted to live to 700 and as a joke. And I still think a lot is lost in life when people die in terms of wisdom. And I can't even imagine with some of the greats, I mean, you're preserving some of these thoughts too, but I can't imagine all of the conversations that could happen if we could live a lot longer. And as David Sinclair has pointed out, I think beautifully in Lifespan, there's really no biological reason why we need to die. Things like the Hydra and other things are models, and certainly that we could radically extend. Now, can we do it short term? I don't know, but imagine the wisdom that is lost every time we lose somebody who is a great thinker. I mean, you and I both would love to, I got to meet Feynman. You got his encyclopedias, as I recall. You bought his encyclopedia set. I did. And I got to meet him during the Challenger. That was where I was. So I met him at Marshall Space Flight Center, and it was just a short discussion because I was working on O-rings back then and when that happened. And so he was a big prominent figure in that investigation. But I didn't get to have the kinds of conversations that, for example, Penn Jillette, when I was listening to your podcast, and to bring this to an end, if you haven't heard Tim's podcast with Penn Jillette, it's phenomenal. But I can just imagine seeing your face when Penn is telling all these stories of calling up Feynman to get help on algebra. I knew, to use my term, you were shitting your plants right there, right? You were shitting your plants, saying what you wouldn't have given to have those conversations. So, Tim, I am so grateful for what you've done for me. And a single question that you asked me, can you keep a secret? I'm writing a book. And I'm thankful for you to take the time and to do this, and for us to be able to just hang out, and for people to kind of hear the conversations we have when nobody's really around. And just what you're doing is amazing. Keep doing it. It has been such a pleasure to watch all the positive change in the world. And I think we're at an unprecedented time where we need so much more cooperation and so much more working together. And most importantly, so much more focus on asking the right questions. So thank you so much for taking this time.
My pleasure, man. This has been a lot of fun. It's been a few weeks since I've had any booze, so this is also a lot of fun. And I would say to those listening that trauma is a fascinating subject. It is also a universal subject, and I would highly suggest that anyone who identifies with that subject or would like to alleviate the suffering associated with that, take a look at capstone.maps.org. That's all I got.
Okay, well, Tim, thank you, and have a great rest of the eating. Get your dog fed, get you fed, break that fast. Thanks, man.
I will.
Well, that went on longer than I planned. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us on this plant-based path to good health. It's always the food for your mind and body, so keep eating right.
Thank you for listening to Science and Saucer. For more details about the content in today's show, or to contact Ray, please visit us at healthspansolution.com.
Welcome to the first day of the rest of your life. Couldn't get any better, should have been much worse. Welcome to the last road on the right of your life. Was paved with good intentions, hoping this is not all that you wrote. All that you wrote.